Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Bianca Collins. I'm the curator of public program for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. Thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. The Fowler is proud to present today's program, The Astonishing Survival of the Gladzor Gospels, as part of our Vital Matters Stories of Belief programs, which explore objects that arouse devotion, awe, or serenity, mediate relationships between human and spiritual realms, and are of vital importance to the cultural heritage of individuals and communities. This series accompanies the new digital initiative, Vital Matters Stories of Belief, a platform for sharing different perspectives on devotional works at the Fowler Museum. The incomparable illuminated manuscript of the Gladzor Gospels is one of the gems of UCLA Library Special Collections. The opening page of the Gospel According to Mark, page 189, is currently on view at the Fowler in the exhibition Communication Systems in a Global Context. Today, we are honored to be joined by S. Peter Cowe, Professor of Armenian Studies, and Chela Metzger, Head of Preservation and Conservation at UCLA Library, for a discussion about the context, content, and materials of this 582-page masterpiece of 14th century Armenian art. We'll hear about its genesis at the Illustrious Center of Learning in Medieval Armenia, the relationship between text and image on the Gospels pages, the traditional Armenian binding structure, and current work underway at UCLA to rebind this world treasure. Vital Matters Stories of Belief is generously supported by a grant from Lilly Endowment Incorporated. S. Peter Cowe is Neraketsi Professor of Armenian Studies and Director of the Center for World Languages at UCLA. His research interests include late antique and medieval Armenian intellectual history, Muslim-Christian dialogue, and modern Armenian nationalism. The author of 5 books in the field and editor of 10, he is a member of the Academia Ambrosiana in Milan and a doctor honoris causa of the Russian Armenian University of Armenia. Consuela Chela Metzger does not have a Latinx background, but inspired by her name, has learned Spanish and collaborated with conservation teams at libraries and archives in Mexico, Guatemala, Peru, and Chile. She holds a library graduate degree and a diploma from the North Bennett Street School in hand bookbinding. Metzger publishes on bookbinding history and is head of preservation and conservation for the UCLA Library, where she has been working together with colleagues on a collaborative effort to rebind the Gladzor Gospels. Before we get going, I just have a few quick technical bits of housekeeping. Once the screen sharing begins, I encourage you to click View Options and select side-by-side mode so the video feed doesn't cover any of the presentation. And if you have any questions during this program, please do submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote questions that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. All right, that's all from me. Over to you, Peter.
Today, my colleague Chela Metzger and I would like to introduce you to a unique early 14th century manuscript held in the Special Collections Department of the Young Research Library at UCLA. The university acquired the codex from a donor, Dr. Garo Minasyan of Isfahan, Iran, in 1968, as part of a larger consignment comprising Persian, Arabic, and Armenian manuscripts, archives, printed books, and artifacts. The collector made an exception in gifting this particular item because of a curse the manuscript bears to the effect that no one should remove it from its location or sell it without incurring the wrath of God and enduring serious harm. The work is an intriguing, lavishly illustrated gospel book executed in Greater Armenia in the south of the Caucasus, in the province of Sunik, not far from the current border with Iran. On opening, you are immediately struck by the dazzling array of color displayed in a rich program of 55 miniatures of the life of Christ, strewn throughout the gospel narrative, introduced by a sumptuous canon tables, brilliant portraits of the 4 evangelists, and a wealth of visually stimulating ornament occupying the text and margins of most of the folios throughout. Note in this image the radiance of a metallic base of the cobalt blue that preserves its sheen over time, in contrast to the vegetable dyes employed in Byzantium. Also impressive is the vibrant red hue Vordan Garmir, manufactured from an indigenous insect. A feast for the eyes, this is but a foretaste of the deeper fascination the codex provokes when the casual viewer begins to penetrate the interlayers of iconography, gesture, and symbol, and comes to appreciate the tradition out of which those features have evolved over a millennium of prayer and pious reflection from the inception of Christianity in Armenia in the early 4th century to the years 1300 to 1307, when this manuscript was copied. That broader period in Armenia is one of great dynamism. From the suzerainty of its northern neighbor Georgia in the early 13th century, Greater Armenia had passed under the rule of the Mongols in the 1240s, which afforded the region a welcome era of peace and stability. This arrangement also coincided with the proclivities of the Armenian aristocracy to preserve as much local economy as possible within a wider imperial structure, ruled by a distant suzerain who would not interfere in their day-to-day administration. Initially, it was governed by the Great Khan in Karakorum, capital of the Mongol homeland. However, when the vast polity, the largest land empire the world has seen, was divided into 4 in 1254, Armenia fell under the immediate sphere of the Ilkhanate centered on Tabriz, which after the attack of Baghdad in 1258 developed into the largest trade entrepot of the region. Although emerging out of a nomadic existence in the inner Asian steppes, the Mongols possessed a keen understanding of economics and appreciated the value of maintaining smooth, safe communications throughout their lands, resulting in the Pax Mongolica, which facilitated long-distance trade both by land and sea. Consequently, we read of Armenian caravans and embassies joining those of other nations in plying the different routes of the Silk Road to Mongolia and China, as well as engaging in seaborne trade with the main Chinese port of Zaiton across the Indian Ocean from the Persian Gulf. As a result, the merchants would return with cargoes of luxury goods, including jewels and textiles, some of the motifs of which, including dragons and cloud patterns, emblazon the pages of contemporary Armenian manuscripts, as those of Iran. Artistic exchange also occurred between the Christian and Muslim communities of the region, as demonstrated by images illustrating an Armenian gospel book like that of Gladsore, being adopted as a model for illustrations of the Prophet Muhammad by the Ilkhanid vizier Rashid ad-Din in his Compendium of Histories, composed in Tabriz over the years 1307 to 16. As noted above, the manuscript under discussion was produced in the southern region of Armenia called Sunik, which was dominated by the Orbelian family in this period. Indeed, one of the princes, Sambat, had gone to Karakorum to establish a claim to the entire province, granted him by the great Khan Menge, as a result of which they became the richest and most influential dynasty of Greater Armenia. Being responsible directly to the Ilkhans of Tabriz, they cultivated a close rapport with their overlords. Well trained in horsemanship and handling weapons, they distinguished themselves in the annual campaigns on which they accompanied their Mongol suzerains. This led to some scions of the family having the distinction of being granted noble Mongol wives, while Burtel, the ranking prince at the time our gospel book was copied, was accorded the title of Hubados, or consul, authorizing him to act as the main representative of his people, and became a frequent visitor at the Mongol court. Moreover, some of the Mongol cavalry would be billeted in the mild mountain pastures of Sunik, as illustrated in this slide, as being cooler than their center of operations further south. Exploiting favor with their suzerain and their location on one of the main thoroughfares running north and west from Tabriz, the Orbelian family embarked on a series of construction projects to foster trade and thereby benefit from transit tariffs, building new roads, bridges, caravanserais, and protective forts, as well as churches and monasteries to establish a reputation for piety. The spiritual center of the province of Sunik at this time was the monastery of Noravank, illustrated in the current slide, which had been the beneficiary of Orbelian largesse over the 13th century. It is here that the first phase of the work on our gospel book began around the year 1300, undertaken under Orbelian patronage by two painters who divided the activity between them. The first copied the whole text, thus determining the scope of the illumination, and then set about executing most of the decorated initials and marginalia, and embellishing the 10 tables of Eusebian canons, prefixing the gospel text. Those had been introduced by the scholar bishop Eusebius of Caesarea in the 4th century to afford readers a comparative schema of passages held in common by all four evangelists, by 3 and 2, and finally those distinct to one or another of the group, as I'll illustrate later. Meanwhile, the second, an artist of even greater ability, produced all the evangelist portraits and the opening pages of the Gospels. There, his chef-d'oeuvre involved portraying the genealogy of Christ, as described at the opening of St. Matthew's Gospel, which we now are reviewing, where Jesus' lineage is traced back via King David to Abraham in a series of 42 linking figures, all of whom, together with Christ at the beginning and end, are portrayed here enthroned in what constitutes the fullest treatment of the subject by any medieval artist of East or West. The painter therefore emerges not only as a craftsman of great innovation, but a figural artist of great distinction. It appears he originally planned to execute all the narrative miniatures in the book, but had only completed 9 before work was interrupted for some unknown reason. After a certain hiatus, work resumed shortly before 1307 in a new environment under different patronage, where 3 further hands finished the assignment in a very different style, employing different paints, as chemical analysis has demonstrated. The new venue was a monastic academy of Gladsore in the Gladsore district of Sunik, to the east of Noravank, under the oversight of the Khachbagians, another branch of the Armenian military aristocracy, who, like the Orbelian, had served their ill-khaned suzerains well and benefited from their support. They too had endowed their monastic foundation with gifts of land and villages, thereby permitting the monks to devote their time to prayer, study, and contemplation. Monasteries in medieval Armenia are majestic structures surrounded by high ramparts, often set on hilltops for additional defense, as here in Datev. High-walled bastions of spirituality, learning, and art, with church spires soaring into the sky, these cenobitic communities, sometimes accommodating several hundred monks, provided excellent continuity for the process of knowledge creation and preservation, in some cases from the 11th century right through to the 19th or early 20th. Over time, they also became significant economic entities that expanded over the peaceful conditions of the 13th century, transforming the original wooden structures into stone, erecting distinct areas for libraries and scriptoria, and creating new multi-purpose spaces called gavit in front of the main shrines, where lectures were held literally at the door of the church. The goal of this education was to become a vartabed, which means literally teacher, a uniquely Armenian ecclesiastical rank, possessors of which were alone accorded the right to preach and teach in church. The curriculum began with the core subjects of the Roman Empire in late antiquity: grammar, rhetoric, and logic, following a pre-Christian model now referred to as ardakin griank, literally external writings, regarded as outside the Judeo-Christian revelation. This would be followed by a corpus of writings referred to as line and nurp griank, literally wide and subtle, the first embracing the biblical spheres of prophecy, apostolic writings, and finally the gospel, while the latter comprised important patristic works of the fathers of the early church. This course of study might last for around 7 years, as the school director saw fit, at the conclusion of which each student was called on to make a formal presentation in the main church, at which all the monastic congregation would be present, together with distinguished guests. We are lucky that some of those dissertations delivered at Gladsore have been preserved. Instead of a cap or gown or parchment, graduates were awarded the vartabedal staff, a black wooden rod culminating in intertwined serpents at the top, symbolizing the acquisition of wisdom. In contrast to other monastic academies, Gladsore was relatively new at this time. However, over the next few decades, it was to acquire a reputation as the primary Armenian center of learning and attracted students from all parts of the Armenian world, different provinces of Greater Armenia, the Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia, and different Armenian colonies around the Mediterranean and Black Sea. Its origins, too, were rather diverse, accepting a community from the Monastery of the Apostles near Lake Van that had been forced to relocate because of Kurdish raids. Thus, the first two directors, Nerses Mishetsi and his more illustrious successor, Yesai Nichetsi, and several of the vartabeds hailed from the west of Armenia, arriving in 1282, with Yesai being appointed abbot 2 years later. In time, he was to commission our manuscript, which, because of its association with his monastery, has come to be known as the Gladzor Gospel book. The awe in which he was held is patent from references to the main artist of the group, completing the illumination, Toros Daronatsi, himself a Westerner, who several times writes notes or colophons below the text, commending his master for his wisdom and insight. As many came to study with him, we know of several scholars who, on completion of their studies, established similar schools in monasteries in other parts of Armenia. So great was the institution's fame that it was styled a second Athens. And indeed, though its primary focus was on theology, some of the manuscripts copied there are vital for the unique links they preserve with pre-Christian Mediterranean culture, such as narratives on the Trojan War and the founding of Rome, the Alexander Romance, and late antique rhetorical exercises on classical themes. The textbooks employed for classes at Gladsore and other monastic academies tended to be works that had established themselves in Greek and then rendered into Armenian in late antiquity, in a process prefiguring the transfer of Greek learning to Arabic in the 8th and 9th centuries. Developments in the understanding of those core texts were normally registered in commentaries based on them, which might take different forms: marginal glosses, brief notes added in the margins of the original text, elucidation of particularly difficult passages, or full line-by-line or verse-by-verse interpretations, which constituted the norm. In the case of liturgical manuscripts like the Gospel book, which were the subject of artistic elaboration, illumination became a further means of interpreting the sacred text. Many of those commentaries would begin life as oral lectures copied down stenographically by advanced students, which would then become the basis for the treatise that would enter into regular circulation. This slide illustrates the process, taking as an example our abbot Yesai lecturing in Gladsore on the prophecy of Isaiah from a manuscript of 1299, from another part of the Armenian world. The director is sitting in his professorial chair, leaning on his black staff of office, with pupils spread around. One of them has been tasked to read the text from a manuscript, which he then interprets. Since knowledge of theology surpassed human epistemology, it was believed that this was only possible through divine inspiration, which is figuratively depicted in this miniature through the blue line of communication that descends from the portion of the sky into the abbot's ear before emanating from his mouth and subdividing to reach the ears of his disciples. The illumination received is then manifest in the depiction of the pomegranate tree in the center of the slide as a symbol of wisdom. Not only is the Gospel book viewed as a receptacle of the divine word of God expressed through Jesus' teaching, but the object itself was believed to partake in the sanctity it witnessed to. A locus of the holy, it was the subject of veneration, carried aloft at the little interest through the Armenian liturgy. Moreover, like the icon in the Byzantino-Slavic tradition, it would also embody the divine presence leading armies into battle and would serve as a medium for prayer. Those examples regarded as particularly effective in answering such petitions were held in especial awe as wonder-working, some of which are the subject of special folk veneration until today. Thus, the activity of interpreting the gospel was viewed in high esteem. At Gladsore, Yesai's pupil Hovannes Sorsoretsi was engaged on a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, which he completed in 1316, and hence some of his emphases find parallels in the iconographic program of UCLA's Gladzor Gospel, as might be expected in a manuscript being produced in that milieu under the patronage of the abbot Yesai, and therefore reflecting the broader contemporary concerns of the director and the monastic community, as we shall see. Consequently, when we pause on some of the miniatures, mentally, we need to step behind the dazzling brilliance of the execution and the exquisite employment of color to detect details beyond straightforward textual representation, to decipher how the artists have subtly insinuated their interpretation of the more profound significance of the life of Christ for Armenian theology and for the Church's liturgical practice. That process particularly concerns the dialogue with Franciscan and Dominican mendicant orders who had disseminated the Latin tradition in the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia and would spread it to Greater Armenia within the next 2 decades. When our gospel book arrived in Gladsore, only about 1/6 of the program had been completed. And so the 3 final artists divided up the remaining subjects among themselves. The 3rd painter selecting 7, the 4th 14, and the 5th Toros Daronatsi, to whom we have been introduced, the final 23. Let's look now at representative sample of scenes from both phases of the Gospel's illumination to gain an insight into the artist's working method. Let's begin with the 9th and 10th canon tables executed by the first painter that represent respectively Solomon's temple on the left and the Holy Catholic Church on the right. Uniquely among the Christian traditions, the Armenians developed a tradition of interpreting the symbolism of the imagery employed on those pages that is meant to purify one's spiritual vision before entering the sacred space of the gospel. Building on the Christianization of the Neoplatonic understanding undertaken by Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite in the 6th century, whose works were rendered into Armenian in the early 8th, these interpretations depict the major facets of the divine economy, from the purely spiritual sphere of the divine and the angelic realm to the creation of man, God's self-revelation to him and dwelling in him, until the process culminates in the New Jerusalem, in the heavenly eternity, utilizing a series of Old Testament images prefiguring the state of bliss that regularly recur in panegyrics of the church from the 8th century onwards. Thus here, the employment of red in the 9th canon table indicates the sacrifice associated with the Solomonic temple, in contrast with the purple of the last, suggesting omnipotent divinity, and green for the immortality of the angels. Similarly, the date palm in 9 highlights Jesus' genealogy from David, while the lions in 10 symbolize the presence of Christ, together with the herons in the spandrels struggling with black serpents as the apostles. More importantly, the monkeys, which appear in Armenian canon tables here for the first time, suggest the contrast between the temple and the church as a locus of the divine, since on the left image, the candle it holds is extinguished, while on the right it is illumined in token of the divine presence. The next scene of the petition of the Canaanite woman from Matthew chapter 15 is striking for occupying a full page, while being absent from the Byzantine tradition. Although commentators often stress here the woman's humility and perseverance, here the third painter has powerfully emphasized the woman's interaction with Jesus through their heightened scale, representing the woman as a symbol of the Church of the Gentiles that has abandoned the idolatry of Tyre and Sidon and recognized Christ as her savior, a theme underscoring the entry of Armenians into the salvation history of the Church. The portrayal of the agony in the garden, according to the Matthean account in chapter 26, is significant in terms of the Gladsore interpretation of Christology, according to the traditional Armenian Miaphysite perspective, arguing for the ineffable union out of two natures into one synthetic divine human nature in Christ that maintains the distinctiveness of each nature intact, rather than employing the Diophysite Chalcedonian formula of one person in two natures confessed by the Latin Church that Pope Clement V was pressing for the Armenian Church to ratify in an upcoming synod, which met in Sis in the year 1307, but which the clergy in Greater Armenia strenuously opposed. This topic is alluded to from another viewpoint in the portrayal of the Johannan account of Christ's last resurrection appearance to the apostles at the Sea of Galilee, which is here undertaken by the final painter Toros Daronatsi, one of the three master painters at Gladsore, who was also a poet. He is the author of some 24 extant manuscripts, displaying his developing maturity in the use of color and creating tenderness of expression from early commissions like this one to his more mature period. Note that Peter is depicted as walking on water in this final scene to reflect his rehabilitation as the chief of the apostles after his denial. However, more important from our point of view is the interpretation of the meal Christ has prepared for the apostles on the table in the upper part of the miniature, which has been approximated to the celebration of the Eucharist, as in the miniature representing the marriage in Cana. The key issue here is the presentation of the Eucharistic bread broken into pieces and placed in a chalice for the faithful to receive together, in contrast to the Latin rite, where the two elements are consumed separately. This depiction thus reinforces the confession of the Eastern churchmen in the years prior to the Synod of 1307, that, I quote, "We are willing to go to hell with our forefathers rather than ascend to heaven with the Romans," unquote. And Yesai's own codicil to that document, in which he adds that, I quote, "We excommunicate with anathemas those who dissent," unquote. I hope this brief overview of the manuscript's historical background, intellectual genealogy, and artistic diversity, together with indications of its more immediate purpose, have served to whet your interest and intrigue regarding this priceless jewel from medieval Armenia, that after several peregrinations in the old world has now arrived in the new and is currently accessible in all its glory online. Let me now hand you over to my colleague, Chela Metzger. Thank you.
All right. Just going to set my timer here so I don't go over time, and I'm going to remove my mask for this. So one moment, please. All right. My name is Chela Metzger, and I'm the head of UCLA Library Preservation and Conservation. I'm very excited to be with everyone here today. Thank you to the Fowler. Thank you, Bianca. Thank you, Peter. I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of your talk. Very exciting. I am going to talk here today really about some of the object qualities of a manuscript of this time period, and in particular, some of the resonance and the power and the beauty of a manuscript from Armenia at this time. So I'm just going to share some preliminary thoughts on what a rebinding might look like today in the 21st century, and some of the concerns and the care issues that UCLA Library might be looking at today. And I'm going to share some of the thoughts of my colleague, Nora Vachan. She and I have presented, she's a UCLA colleague here on our, a librarian of Armenian heritage. And she and I presented on this manuscript before, and I'm going to share some of her thoughts today. And just to remind everybody where this manuscript has been, we didn't get to the end of Peter's talk, but you know, it was born in Armenia. It traveled in the 1600s to Isfahan in Persia, and in the 60s came across to Los Angeles. So it's quite an amazing trek for an amazing manuscript made in 1300. So here's some of the thoughts that Nora has shared with me as an Armenian on the meaning of a manuscript, and within some of her thoughts on the Armenian culture. So it's obviously a distinctive object. It has craft skills, art skills, manuscript skills, all of these things distinctively Armenian. It is also a sacred object, which is why we're having to talk about it today. It is used during prayers, and the script of Armenia is in and of itself considered sacred. And so anything written in that script can have certain kinds of reverence and sacred qualities. There's a kind of collective sense of ownership. Armenians are proud of these amazing products, these amazing cultural production. And in the words of Professor Christine Amansi, they are the affirmation of the Armenian identity. They can be given certain kinds of powers, potentially to cure diseases, and they can be something to sort of fear. You don't want to do wrong by something of this kind of sacred power. And some of the distinctions that Armenian manuscripts share with other Eastern Orthodox or Eastern Orthodox Christian manuscripts is an incredible colophon. Any of you who are book people here, you might imagine, okay, a colophon, it tells you the date, the name of the printer, a few other details. But the colophons of Eastern manuscripts, Eastern Christian manuscripts, often really are extraordinarily detailed and give you, for example, where they bought the parchment, how they managed to acquire the ink, who the original idea came from, how it went, what troubles they ran into, what were the delays, who did the binding, and you know, all of that. So it's extraordinary, these colophons. They have amazing history. And of course, they are unique because they have a unique binding style. And I'll talk about this more, but you know, this is a model of a Armenian binding, just a little book binding model that I made to try to understand it better. They are unique, and book binding, like any craft tradition, is like a fingerprint. It tells you so much about where a book was made, and really what kinds of how much money people spent on it. So. And I think something else unique to think about with the Gladsore, and it's actually something very common to all medieval manuscripts, is a kind of a rules, or you might call it a curse, on the manuscript. And so here's a translation: whoever divides this manuscript. And I think this is where we, you know, is going to run into trouble. And I think when we talk about disbinding without rebinding, we're pretty close to that divide issue. And so that's part of what prompted my conversations today about this. So we're going to talk a little about the care of the manuscript at UCLA Library now. Okay, so I'm just going to give a little update of obviously something that's been cared for at UCLA Library for a very long time. And of course, we need to acknowledge the unbelievable care it took to get a manuscript from 1300 all the way to today in the 21st century. That took care from generations and generations and generations of people. Here's something that an Armenian if you want to think like, what might an Armenian manuscript look like? This is a picture from the Manuscripts Library in Yerevan of some various Armenian manuscripts on a table. You might see that there's metal on them. You might see that there's clasps holding them shut. You probably can't see that they have wooden boards or very particular kinds of end bands, but you can see that perhaps these have a look. These have a particular look. And, you know, that's because the book bindings are unique in different parts of the world. The actual structure, which I'm not going to go into in huge detail here, you know, it's unique to Armenia. The way the pages are held together are unique to Armenia. The way the end band works, completely unique to Armenia. The way the boards are attached, unique to Armenia. This foredge flap on the side, also unique to Armenia. So there are, and these are kind of a prototype of a medieval manuscript, some of the structures of a medieval manuscript here. Now, I make bookbinding models, and so I wanted to kind of show you a family of bindings that the Armenian structure falls into. On your screen here, you see what's on my left. I just guess it's on your left. There's an Ethiopic Christian binding model on the top, an Armenian Christian binding model under that, a Syriac Christian binding model in the red there, and on the bottom with the gold on the side of the text is a Byzantine binding model. These are all the kinds of bindings that might have been put on sacred Christian texts through time, and they don't look like something from the Roman Catholic tradition. And I want to emphasize that they are not structurally the same at all. They're quite different. So, and they have a different board attachment, as the middle slide shows, and they kind of look different on the spine. You might know these, that's not a good example. Roman Catholic books, they might have these big bumps on the spine, these great big wide bumps. Those bumps are not going to be seen in Orthodox Christian books. And if you do see them, you know it's been bound somewhere else. And what might the decoration have been like? These are all decorations, beautiful decorations on Armenian books. From my left to right, it's a decoration that was perhaps done in 1577. The brown there, they think it was bound in 1651. The next one they believe was bound in 1695 in Isfahan, so that's interesting. And then the one with all the metal work, they actually think might have been a 13th century binding. So these are some of the decorative ways that a book might look. In particular, I think you need to understand that these are on sacred texts. These are not on science books or books of poetry. These are sacred text, and that's the decorations are reflecting that. Now, when the book came to UCLA in 1968, we must remember that it had lived in Persia and in Iran for a very long time, since the 1600s. The last Armenian custodian to have it rebound was in 1824, 1825, we think, and they put a very traditional Persian binding on this. This is a Persian lacquer binding. So you're seeing the front cover and the back cover of a very beautiful Persian lacquer binding on an Armenian medieval manuscripts. And it is the fate of manuscripts to be rebound. And at that time, the owner, perhaps they couldn't find anyone who knew how to do traditional Armenian bookbinding. Who knows exactly what was going on, but as a sign of respect and as a sign of care for this manuscript, this is the binding it was put on in Persia in 1824-25. We still have those covers, but they're no longer attached to the text block pages. And just to give you a sense of what the binding looks like today, the Gladzor Gospels actually have been separated into their sections, and each section lives in a file folder in a very secure place, and we keep them horizontally. But it is really an enormous change from any of the books you've seen before. And it can in some ways be thought of as keeping I mean, it's certainly being kept together, and some people might say, well, it's safer to keep them all apart for different kinds of reasons. There's different ways of thinking about that, but certainly at UCLA, the thought has been to rebind this for quite a while. The UCLA curator, back when this was disbound in 1982, noted the proper conservation of the manuscript requires that it be rebound, but that still awaits forward motion. So just to kind of go through this again, we received the gift in 68. The pigments were analyzed in 79. It was disbound in 82 for some sense that the binding was having some problems and that the pages at the beginning were not in order. There was a major monograph done scholarly on the Gladzor Gospels in 91. It was fully described in a catalog of Armenian manuscripts in 99. The full conservation of each front and back of every leaf that's on parchment, which is on, an animal skin from 1300, was done by the conservator at the Getty, Nancy Turner, who's their manuscripts conservator. And she made sure that every little bit of pigment, the writing, the painting, the illuminations, everything was tested and secured with a gelatin adhesive when needed to keep it adhered to the page. So it's in actually excellent condition right now because of her labor and care. There was another monograph done in 2001 on the Gladsore. There was a major Getty exhibit in 2001, taking advantage of the disbound state of it to put things on the wall in frames. And then it was fully digitized in 2008, which certainly is easier to do on a disbound manuscript. But now the question is, we've kind of taken advantage of all the things that disbound manuscript provides, and it might be time to think about rebinding. But the question is, who should be part of that conversation? So that we've corrected the mistakes that we think the last binder did in putting the pages in order. We've exhibited it, we've stabilized the pigments, we've studied the pigments, we've digitized the bifolios. So it's available digitally now to anybody. But I think we can argue that disbinding has diminished the intent of the last owner. It can result in damage. I think so far we're lucky it has not, but it is when every page is separate, every page is a little more vulnerable than it used to be. Unity and sequence can be put at risk with any kind of loss or damage, and the intent of the original creator in 1300 is really potentially not being honored here. So rebinding is an opportunity as a book conservator. This is something I do almost never, very rarely. You see me here working on a Syriac manuscript that happened to be a palimpsest at the Walters that I was rebinding after it had been digitized. When you do I had the boards for that one. When you have nothing of the original binding, I think most book conservators in America today have been very influenced by the Book of Kells. The Book of Kells was rebound in the 1950s, very famous Irish manuscript. Everybody goes to see it when they go to Ireland. And it's the idea of that rebinding was a kind of a noble simplicity. They didn't try to do any decoration on it at all. And in fact, the binder who did that work said it should not be a facsimile, there should not be ornamentation. You just want to have it kind of have a slight reminiscence of its original and focus more on the way the book opens and not on any decoration. And I've done that kind of work. Here's an example of a commentaries on St. Augustine's City of God, 1505. I rebound long time ago now, and I didn't do any decoration at all. I just made and did a complete new binding with sort of a nice end band. But it's very, I think today in the 21st century, we can probably understand there's no such thing as a neutral rebinding. Just because I put it in white in a very conservation level animal skin, is that neutral? I don't think so. I put no decoration on it. That's a very culturally determined decision. And to put no decoration at all on a gospel book seems, well, something to be discussed. And here's an example of a medieval decorative scheme and a facsimile of a medieval Armenian binding. But is that neutral? It's a 21st century product that I made. And if I rebind it, or if anybody rebinds it today, we are rebinding it in the 21st century. So what should we be thinking about? It is the fate of books to be rebound. It is like frames on art. The older the art is, the more likely it's had many different frames. Rebinding is an act of cultural and technical care. And it can be a collaboration. And I think this is where I really want to end today, to talk about the collaboration being at least as important as any technical care, because technically we're taking good care of it now, but there's additional steps that are perhaps culturally important and collaboratively essential. So we're talking about sharing the work of rebinding with Armenian conservators. We've been talking about a film about the rebinding, a scholarly conference. We've been talking about calligraphy and celebrating the calligraphy in some way in our community, maybe making a new colophon to be bound separately. And really, really, what should this look like? I know how to make it safe for the pages, the parchment pages, but what should it look like? So I just want to thank everybody today, and I'll want to especially thank Nora Avechan and Jeannie Harard, who have worked with me at UCLA on thinking about this manuscript. Certainly my colleagues at the Matanat Loran in Yerevan, Armenia, and I will get off of here, and hopefully we hear more from Peter.
Thank you so much, Chela. Yes, Peter disappeared and he's not back, which is too bad, but we'll be sure to revisit his presentation and make sure that the finished presentation's in the archive that we share of this program. So everyone who comes to our programs is told at the end that we do record our programs, and they're available immediately on our Facebook, but then we upload an official archival program recording to our Instagram and to our website. So we'll make sure that the archive of this program is complete with Peter's full presentation.
Great.
In the meantime, we're going to start our question and answer. So if the audience has any questions for Chela, please do submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. All right, so I would love to start with a question from Nancy. And this is discussing the book's curse. And she's curious to know if there are any stories about people handling or taking the book that have just found it experiencing anything odd.
Well, I don't know any exact stories, but I can tell you that I'm feeling quite haunted by the manuscript. So I personally, I mean, people knew that this book had power. One of the parts of the colophon that Peter didn't get a chance to talk about is the fact that, like many medieval manuscripts that were considered treasures, that invade cultures that were at war, like whoever was at war would steal those manuscripts. So Tamerlane actually kidnapped this manuscript and demanded ransom to get it back. And so there was a noble Armenian woman who was the owner, and when they took it, she ransomed it back. So there was the power of the manuscript, and the need to keep it whole and cared for is sort of clear in many different ways the manuscript is talked about. And I didn't include these images, but there are in the Armenian active veneration of manuscripts, the manuscript might be kissed, it might be taken through town to be kissed. There's some interesting films at the on the Matanadaran website of villages that have a manuscript that's important to them, that they don't want it, they wanted it conserved, but they wouldn't let it leave the village because they were afraid that it might affect their crops. So the conservators actually went to the village to do any repair and restoration of the manuscript. And so I think that tells you something of the cultural power that these manuscripts have and continue to have within various cultures.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we actually had a couple of questions about that, so I hope everyone's satisfied with that answer. And we have a question about whether or not you guys are considering putting the Persian binding back on.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Absolutely, I think that has to be considered. It is there. It was the last binding chosen by an Armenian owner. Now, I've heard various discussions about this. I would say from the sheerly technical point of view, you're looking at you're looking at pages that are, in this case, this is a paper model, but parchment. Parchment is an animal skin. It expands and contracts with different temperatures and humidity. All of the medieval world used heavy wooden boards and clasps, kind of somewhat of a strap to hold the book shut and under pressure to keep the parchment in good condition, to keep it from expanding and contracting and absorbing too much air, because it would deform. The Persian lacquer binding has no way to do that. A Persian lacquer binding was created for a paper text block, and it never needed heavy boards, and it never needed straps. So from a purely technical point of view, there's a reason to put it back in a more traditional Armenian style binding with straps. Now, this model doesn't have straps, but straps are something you see in medieval parchment text blocks. So my book conservator head tells me that it is right in rebinding it to do the best I can do for the parchment. Now, from the point of view of the owners, whether they had the choice of getting an Armenian binding done or not, since the binding was in New Julfa in Isfahan in Iran in 1825, there may have really not been an Armenian bookbinder who knew the traditional techniques. We don't know. we would certainly never throw away the Persian binding. And I think it's essential that we understand this as a world product, a global cultural product, object in of veneration. And so it is not I'm not saying anything bad about the Persian lacquer binding. It simply doesn't do the job that a more medieval style binding would do.
Okay, thank you. We have some questions about the materials.
Okay.
Plant and mineral pigments were used to color the manuscript, and also what was used for the halos, the golden halos.
Yeah. And in the medieval world, they were very sophisticated in how they used gold. If you look at the manuscript, and I'm not going to be able to describe it in the most technical detail. I have not studied the manuscript in that way. I came in kind of late in its life. There's been monographs and research done on this. Then I can try to link you up to that so you get the final word on that. And I would say we're still studying the pigments. But the parchment is a beautifully fine, incredibly well produced calf skin. It's very elegant calf skin. The pigments are very often mineral pigments, but not always. So a red is usually a vermilion, which is a mineral red, but reds can be also done in different ways. Gold can be used as gold leaf, and you get a certain kind of sheen and reflective quality for that. And I would say that in the large gold backgrounds, most likely that was done with gold leaf, and they polish it with an agate to really make it gleam. But there's, for example, gold writing. Now it is done with real gold. So don't diminish gold paint, because gold paint is extremely hard to make. It's called shell gold. And so they would use a powdered gold that was put in a binder like sometimes egg, but I think often gum arabic, and used to make gold lettering or to make fine details out of gold. So they knew the effect of the gold that they wanted, and they would mix and match on a page to get really bright shine or highlights. It just depended on the gold effect that they wanted.
Thank you. It's so interesting to know. So what would you say are some of the unique characteristics that especially make Armenian manuscripts distinct from other Christian sects?
Oh, I think all manuscripts are amazing. So I may be the wrong person to ask, but I would say that in Armenian manuscripts, and I would say this the same for Ethiopic manuscripts, is a living tradition of active care, active veneration. I mean, today, a book of hours from France just isn't used the same way. It's not used in liturgy the same way. It's not used in the Roman Catholic Church the same way. But the Armenian manuscript and a few other manuscript traditions are used in an active way that draws a direct line, I think, to their creation and gives them a cultural power that is a little different. I think today we have to kind of imagine how important a book of hours might be in a way that we don't have to imagine with, for example, an Ethiopic Christian text or an Armenian Christian manuscript.
Thank you. And is the traditional Armenian book binding format still practiced, or is it strictly historical?
Well, book conservators of necessity tried to learn how old books were made, which is why, you'll see me with this pile of models, is you study old books, and if you plan on intervening physically in an old book's life, you need to understand how it was put together. And so I would say that it is a living tradition, bookbinding. and that there are people, especially, for example, at the Matanadaran and Yerevan, who are still creating book bindings in this tradition. Are they using the exact same tools that were used in 1300? Probably not. Are there secrets of binding that have gone away because nobody passed them on? Probably, but we try. There's a woman who does a lot of work on the Armenian bindings here in the United States in Library of Congress, who when she makes a new binding, she'll follow the traditions of these earlier bindings. You try to make some subtle technical changes that relieve any stress on the manuscript, instead of just blindly following exact steps that may have been passed down through history. You think to yourself, how can I make it look appropriate while not hurting the pages when it opens and closes? And I think that gets you into some of the problem solving that that book conservators use. But there's very few completely dead bookbinding traditions out there. They have evolved, and are, even if it's just book conservators who are reapplying them, they are alive.
Thank you. Okay, let's just do one last question so we can leave some time in the hour for the rest of Peter's presentation.
Okay.
Let's just answer this one last question from Gohar, who's asking two parts of a question. How long would a rebinding take? And you've spoken about noble, simple, and neutral rebindings. And if you had the option for a new binding for the Gladzor Gospels, what would your favorite solution be?
Yeah, I am not going to talk about a favorite solution because I feel like I want to, even those talks, I think, need to be done collaboratively. I don't have one. I am open to many options as long as they keep the text blocks safe and together. But a rebinding can, the hard work in many ways of this manuscript in terms of its preservation has already been done. You saw that Nancy Turner at the Getty, their manuscripts conservator, spent several years doing the pigment consolidation. That means looking at the book under a microscope, leaf by leaf, every centimeter of that page, and testing it with a little tiny brush. Does the pigment move? Is it secure? And if it's not secure, taking that tiny little brush, it's like 2 hairs wide, and slipping a tiny bit of gelatin under that tiny bit of red paint or gold to make sure it stays adhered to the paper or the parchment. That work is solid. We test it all the time, all the time to make sure it's solid. It is solid. That was actually the most time consuming work, and that took a few years. I mean, she did other things, but it took a time. The rebinding probably wouldn't take more than a few weeks, max. It's simply sewing it, attaching the boards, and covering it in leather. The more complicated issue is, as I've said, should there be decorations? What should the end band be like? The issue of there being strong, I have not completely made up my mind, but I feel strongly that it should have heavier boards and some kind of closure to make sure that the text block stays under pressure. Those are the things I'm careful about maintaining in my head. But other than that, I really do feel open. And I think that one of the things I've thought about is keeping maybe the binding a little simpler and putting a lot of beautiful decoration on the box, which kind of allows 2 philosophies of kind of book conservation to live at the same time.
Thank you so much, Chela, for sharing so much of your wisdom with us today. We had so many questions come in just about the work that you do. So thank you so much for
Thank you
all today. And thank you for everyone who joined us today for your great questions and for participating in that way. This program has been recorded, and as I said, it will be available immediately on our Facebook, but we'll upload a full, complete version of this program sometime after the Thanksgiving holiday in the week following. So thank you so much for looking out for that and resharing as you see fit once it's available to you. We hope that you'll join us again for our next program. You can find details on the closing slide. In the meantime, have a great week. See you next time.